Okay, guys, today we're looking at indicator 4.5, and mainly what it is about is it's still about how cities begin to grow in the United States, also about political corruption that's going to go on in the late 1800s. And so that's what this lesson's mostly going to be about. And so we're going to start on 4.5. And of course, on the title slide, you can see it says urbanization, ethnic neighborhoods, and political machines. We're also going to talk about the influx of immigrants into the United States during this period, and we're going to talk about why. So as always, let's write our learning objectives down. There are a few for this one. So if you need to pause the video and then jot these down, this should be the first thing that you write down. And then once the video is over with, go back and answer these learning objectives. Pay special attention to it while you're watching the video. So first, let's talk about the development of cities. How do cities develop? And there's usually three things that we like to say. There are three stages of development. The first would be that usually cities would start out developing as centers of trade, meaning trade going in and out. Places like New York, those types of places started off as centers of trade. Second would be they became transportation hubs, meaning a lot of railroads coming into those areas as well. And then, of course, later on it would be highways and so on. But they became transportation hubs. And the third stage of development was they become centers of industrial production. So a lot of industry is going to take place in those areas. So these are the three stages. Make sure you write them down. Make sure you know them. During the late 1800s, we saw a lot of technological inventions that are going to help cities expand not only upward but outward as well. Again, these new technologies are going to allow cities to grow. Things like the elevator, steel girders, steel, of course, a lot stronger than iron. We sort of talked about that when we talked about Andrew Carnegie. We saw suspension bridges being built for the first time, making it easier to cross rivers, especially big, wide rivers. So the suspension bridges definitely help with that. Before they had suspension bridges, they had to use ferries to cross some of these larger rivers. And that would take a lot longer. Now you've got them crossing over rivers and connecting places that you couldn't connect before. So these suspension bridges definitely are going to help, especially with transportation and infrastructure. You had the electric trolley car, which was used sort of like the modern bus system that could ferry people all throughout the city. So we saw those emerge. You saw elevated tracks where train tracks would run through a city, and of course you could drive a car or a wagon or whatever underneath it. So they began to develop those things as well. You saw subways underneath the ground so they wouldn't take up space within the city and wouldn't cause a blockage of traffic flow and so on. So subways began to emerge as well. So all of these are technological inventions that occurred during this period to help cities expand and to grow. Like we said, farmers began to move to cities. Remember that we discussed this earlier, how farmers were growing a lot of crops due to all the new inventions. And then, of course, the supply went up, which meant demand went down, prices lowered. Some farmers began to lose their land. They needed work, so they began to move to cities. We also have sort of discussed how immigrants began to move from Europe and from China and Asia, how they began to move to cities because they weren't finding a lot of jobs in their homeland. And then, of course, a lot of upper class people would move to the cities because they wanted the cultural life and the excitement of living in a city, the theater and being able to go to a coffee shop or whatever it may be. So those were things that were enticing. Remember, we've talked about push and pull factors before, but those would have been pull factors to these cities. So why did the immigrants flock to the cities? And there were a few, mainly from Europe, the Italians, the Poles from Poland, many Jews from Europe, and then, of course, the Russians. began to flock to cities. They came there because they needed help finding homes and jobs. So again, that was a pull factor. They were being pushed away from their countries because they couldn't find jobs or they were being persecuted or so on. Those would have been push factors. Pull factors meant that they were coming to America to find better homes, better jobs, a better standard of life for the most part. Now, as these immigrants began to come into these cities, they were taken advantage of, and one of the people, or some of the people that took advantage of these new immigrants, were these political bosses. And these political bosses are going to try to get votes from these people to actually help them, or from these immigrants to actually help them get government positions. A lot of the immigrants did flee to certain sections of the city, and they sort of formed their own little community within the city. These ethnic ghettos or ethnic neighborhoods began to emerge in these cities as well. So please make sure you write that down and you understand that. But they are going to try to get help from these political bosses. We're going to look at a few of them in just a minute. So what's going to be their impact on politics? Well, immigrants are going to have a powerful effect on politics because as they came in, these political bosses were going to them and they were going to vote for whoever could help them find jobs. If you could help them find a job, then they were willing to give their vote to this person. A lot of them did it out of loyalty and gratitude. The bosses also looked out for the voters. They would help make improvements in communities, some of these ethnic communities. But for the most part, most of these political bosses were very corrupt. They took bribes. They did all kinds of things that were sort of unethical. They used bribery and graft in arranging city contracts. A graft is illegal use of political influence for personal gain. So they would use their position to actually help them make money, and that's really not very fair. So these political bosses, bad guys, use bribery, use their positions in order to gain money and wealth. One of the most notorious is a guy named Boss Tweed. Of course, here's a famous quote from him: "I don't care who does the electing so long as I do the nominating." So he was actually picking the people that they were going to nominate. He was the boss of an organization known as Tammany Hall. He named nominations for the Democratic Party in New York City. So whoever they thought the people would pick, he would pick. He would actually make the nomination himself for who should run for those positions for the Democratic Party. His candidates would always get elected as mayor, governor, and so on. So he was picking pretty much everybody during that period. He was eventually convicted of stealing $25 to $45 million from taxpayers and basically using it for his own personal interest. As these cities began to grow, a lot of problems are going to emerge, especially as the immigrants and farmers and all these people began to flood into the cities. There became an issue with overcrowding. We saw tenement apartments. This is one over here on the right. A tenement, of course, is just basically an apartment. There became problems with sanitation because of all the people living there. Things weren't necessarily very clean. Transportation was an issue because you had all these people moving around in the city. You had to figure out a way to organize the streets and so on to get it where people could actually move through the city freely. Issues with water, issues with crime, and then, of course, issues with fire because of all the overcrowding within these cities. So you can see how urbanization is definitely changing the shape of cities. Last group that's going to play a big role in the late 1800s are going to be the African Americans. And of course, during this period, we have something called the Great Migration. The reason for this migration was a couple of things. Number one, the South still relied on cotton even during the late 1800s, but they didn't know about crop rotation. So soil got exhausted from growing cotton in those fields over and over and over again. And then the boll weevil came in and started destroying the cotton crop. So um, African Americans began to lose jobs. The other problem was that the African Americans had to deal with Jim Crow laws in the South. They had to deal with lynching and intimidation. Because of those things, they're going to look to move away from the South. But when they got to the North, they realized that there was still discrimination against them. They had the old saying, last hired, first fired. Usually, these African Americans were the last people to be hired. And if a company wanted to downsize or get rid of someone, they were usually the first to be fired. A lot of the African Americans were resented by strikers because they would come in and do the work that these strikers were striking against these companies. So they were often referred to as scabs. Scabs are people that come in and fill in jobs while the other workers are striking. So these African Americans were considered scabs in some cases. They were forced to live in the least desirable areas of the city. So the neighborhoods were segregated, much like they were in the South. So even though they migrated north, it wasn't necessarily better for them. So anyway, we're going to stop there. That is the end of 4 or 5. Make sure that you look at these key vocabulary terms and you write them down and define them. Please don't turn in your note sheet without defining the words and making sure that they're all looked up and you know the meanings of all these things on this slide. If you need to pause it for a second, pause, and we're going to move on to your reflect section. Again, you don't have to write these questions down, but you do need to include it on your notes, your reflect. Go back and look at some of these things, answer these questions, and you will be good to go. And hopefully you understand everything that we just went over in this lesson. Okay, guys, that's going to do it, and we'll pick up with 4-6 coming up on the next presentation.